Welcome to the VCA podcast, where we explore how leaders, investors, entrepreneurs, and senior decision makers uncover growth opportunities beyond the obvious, often by finding the missing piece hidden in another sector, another geography, another technology layer, or another ecosystem. At VCA, we often speak about cross-pollination and unknown unknowns, the opportunities that remain invisible when we stay inside our own silos. Today's conversation is a perfect example of that approach because we're going one layer beneath the AI adoption discussion. Many companies are asking how to adopt AI, but fewer are asking where the AI they adopt actually comes from, who controls it, how transparent it is, and whether Europe can build AI infrastructure that is open, trusted, vendor neutral, and commercially relevant. Our guest today is Michael Berns, head of AI at the Eclipse Foundation. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Chris. Thank you for having me.
The Eclipse Foundation is a non-profit, vendor-neutral open source foundation headquartered in Brussels and home to more than 440 open source software projects. Michael joined in 2026 to lead the foundation's global strategy for open source AI. Michael brings more than 13 years of applied AI experience across financial services, regulation, and enterprise transformation. Before joining Eclipse, he spent 7 years as director of AI at PwC Germany, where his work was recognized by Gartner and Forrester across more than 100 publications. Earlier in his career, he spent 16 years in London with organizations including Digital Reasoning, Morgan Stanley, MSCI Barra, Moody's Analytics, and Wolters Kluwer. He is a native German and English speaker, an executive MBA from the London Business School, a TED Talk Idea Challenge winner, and has been named one of the global top 10 fintech innovators. Michael's work is particularly relevant for the VC ecosystem because open source AI is no longer just a technical topic. It is becoming a procurement issue, a governance issue, an investment issue, and potentially a strategic wedge for European AI companies. So today, we will discuss vendor-neutral AI, open source as a commercial model, cross-pollination at the infrastructure layer, and why policy conversations at the G7 and UN level matter for investors, advisors, enterprises, and founders. Michael, welcome to the VCA podcast.
Thank you so much.
Michael, tell us a bit about you, who you are, and what you do at the Eclipse Foundation.
Sure. I'm, as you mentioned, the head of AI at the Eclipse Foundation. But maybe in terms of my background, I spent my 16 years working globally out of London, and I've been in AI for some 13 years, as you correctly mentioned. So from that side, I took my time in my early career to go in terms of innovative data companies in fintech, to then make my way after the executive MBA and startup mentoring towards the field that I was most passionate about, which has been AI. And I think this grip hasn't really let me go again. So that's why I spent such a long time in that field, and it still fascinates me as much today as it did back then. A bit more on the Eclipse Foundation. Yes, we are non-profit, vendor neutral, and we work on more than 400 open source software projects around the world. I had a chance to work with some open source elements in my early days in artificial intelligence, but it wasn't maybe governed by a foundation as such. It was more that back then the data scientists shared their library somewhere online, and then other data scientists would find it and try and test it and so on. So today it's a bit different. I really work with the ecosystem that we have in terms of our current members, but I also look at what's happening. For this year, of course, we are seeing a lot in the agentic AI space, but kind of the second wave. So you could say it has moved on from a discussion of the art of the possible to how do I secure now that I can see that there is an upside? How do I run this in a secure way? And then a lot of the discussions that I also do, apart from building the ecosystem that we have, is around policy and some of those public sessions for education and so on.
So, what does a head of AI mean in a non-profit foundation context, as opposed to inside a technology company or a consultancy?
Look, I mean, the 13 years before, I built commercial products with clients like HSBC. I did global rollouts. I worked with Morgan Stanley, Goldman, and other players, including the regulators. But I had a different life. It was more like moving on from implementation to implementation with a lot of commercial focus. This is in the open source space. It's more about trying to find opportunities to collaborate openly and transparently. And for me personally, the reason why I took this role was to really help Europe, where we are headquartered and we are not really far from the European Commission, to get ahead in terms of AI. I know we took our time in Europe to embrace this subject, but it's really a time where we kind of need to look in terms of where the world is moving, in terms of sovereignty, independence, and then also see where we still have some strong points when it comes to the AI. So it means something different. In the foundation, it's really which open source AI projects should exist, how do we build the governance around them, and then how the whole ecosystem holds together. And at times when our voice is called upon, be it the French presidency of the G7, France has always taken a strong interest in AI for quite a few years to give some voices, or at other times United Nations and so on. These public organizations, they trust us and the committee we stand for in terms of our members to provide a transparent feedback on some of the upcoming policies and policy work that is ongoing. So in the short version, I'm not shipping commercial products anymore. I've had my time as a product owner and as a engagement director building out implementations, but I'm now looking at people building in that space and what we could build together, either directly at the Eclipse Foundation, people bringing their repositories, part of their IP, and then sharing it for the greater good for Europe and other means.
So, in your view, what is the unknowns sitting in the European AI conversation right now?
I mean, as we all know, the European AI buyers often default to the familiar US providers, and maybe given that they had the advantage of first movement, there's maybe nothing wrong with this. But it would be wrong for Europe to say, okay, we make ourselves completely dependent and we just accept that we have nothing to show and we are moving on. And similar things could be said in terms of the East. We are somewhere stuck in the middle and we want to build our own solutions, our own platforms, and so on. So the known and the known unknown is really the space so that you can name different options and you can look at what it would take to evaluate those options. But there's a really open source layer underneath both of those things. And the actual models, the runtime, the governance tools, we can really do a lot in terms of being a steward for this in Europe. So, I mean, this is kind of what you also write about, right? The visible constraint is not the real constraint, but we kind of need to pick a model. But the real question is, where does this model come from? Who controls it? And what do you provide? Everything that leads up to you even using a model. It's the whole infrastructure and platforms based on industry ecosystems and so on.
So Magnus Jern was on the VC podcast in April talking about AI adoption inside enterprises. Where does your work sit relative to that adoption conversation?
I mean, first off, I have some genuine respect for Magnus' work. He covered really the full adoption playbook. Um, I'm maybe like you could say a layer upstream. His episode is, I would say, more about how organizations absorb AI. And I've been in this game for a long time when they didn't even know that they needed AI, right? When you were trying to sell AI systems 13 years ago, you still had to convince people that this actually exists and that it works. And this is the upside. And this is the factor X based on your investment and so on. So he is really explaining the adoption conversation. I'm trying to explain where the thing being adopted comes from. So it's kind of really these two conversations connect. If European enterprises are adopting AI built on a transparent, auditable, vendor neutral foundation, I think they're in a better position in terms of procurement, regulation, and concentration risk rather than just adopting something from the shelf or giving everyone the same standard licenses and so on.
Yeah, and when you say open source AI, what do you actually mean?
That's been an interesting one and one that I had to get used to joining the foundation. I would say you have this 1.5-year-old definition by the OSI, and this is quite narrow. You could say it's not just using AI tools in an open source project, but it's really, if you were to update this older definition or go more granular, then you want really at the model level, you want the weights, the training code, the evaluation methodology, and ideally, of course, the data. I mean, we could have just a conversation on data and why it's not being shared. But I think that would derail this podcast. So on the data side, let's just say there are still a number of legal cases in the US and as well in Europe, which are not decided yet. And in terms of whether these hyperscalers or others harvested data that they shouldn't have been using, that is maybe undecided. We can kind of get a steer, but it's maybe too early to come to a conclusion of this. Let's just at this point say, ideally, you want to know what data went in. Very few will share that fully with you, but some might give you a hint or let's say a classification or this type of data or without going into formal detail, right? So you could say there is a spectrum. We could start with open weights only, and China, some of the models that have been coming out of China in the last few years have been very much in the open weights space. But what most people would call open source AI today should be even more transparent, and there's another layer and so on. So why does it matter? You cannot really govern what you cannot inspect. So open source AI is a prerequisite for auditability in terms of the EU AI Act that it requires, but we don't have it yet. And then maybe we come to these topics later when you have situations like mutos and so on. It becomes a question, what should the US government demand? And then also what should the EU government demand based on those model builders and others that are now going into the cyber domain and other things. But I think we come to that a little bit later.
Where does the line sit between an open source model and one with merely open weights? And by the way, if you could explain to the audience, which may not be so familiar with AI, what open weights actually means.
So, sure. So the open weights means you get the numerical parameters, so you can run the inference, right? You can ask the questions to the model. You can fine tune. It's generally useful. But if you were to take a step further, then that should mean that you also get the training data, the training code, the full methodology, everything needed to reproduce the result. Now, I mean, you know this, and many of the listeners will know this too. The competition between the frontier model builders is such that we are now talking about nearly weekly, maybe monthly update cycles, which used to be maybe half a year. So these competition forces them to push out some update constantly, but that also means they will be even less inclined than some years ago to share the underlying data and what's under it, right? And if they were to share how to fully build the model, it would probably be detrimental to their market presence and so on. They would lose some of their competitive edge. So we are in a tough spot where, some of the original builders of open weights models, like Llama, Mistral, and so on, they're really just open wells. There's no fully open source behind it by a strict definition. And yet we also see Google and others with the Gemma line to publish those models, but it's not the full transparency just yet. So this distinction really matters because if you cannot reproduce the training run, and we both know these GPTs and so on, they are not deterministic. You cannot fully audit the model for bias, safety issues, or unexplained behavior. So we kind of have a situation where, in terms of the EU AI Act, the General Purpose AI transparency, the open source model would be a much stronger position than just the open weights alone in terms of explaining what's happening. So this is kind of like a discussion really around explainable AI and kind of setting some KPIs or ideals where people want to move to in terms of their model publications and publishing and so on.
Yes. When you say vendor neutral, this can sound like a slogan. What does it actually mean inside the Eclipse Foundation?
I guess that's a fair pushback, but the proof is really in the government. It's not like a marketing deck. So you could say, hey, Eclipse Foundation, why do you have Microsoft, Google, and many other of the big players as members? Well, we still want them at the table. We just want them to be at a, you could say, democratic table where everybody has the same input. Not one vendor is preferred in any way, and it really moving things towards a meritocratic setup where over time the vendors who are putting the most effort in terms of committers and therefore relevant commits in terms of the code will have maybe slightly more influence in terms of building the product, but in terms of the governance and who looks at this and everything else, it's really about this fair system where not just one will fully dominate this, right? So you could have situations where Microsoft, Bosch, SAP, Huawei, Red Hat all sit on the same table, and none of them can really dictate the project because they didn't author it. So it's not just nice things about neutrality. It's really a governance structure that has some teeth, and you can't really circumvent it.
And why is vendor neutrality becoming a procurement relevant filter for European enterprises?
I mean, the EU Act, the Cyber Resilience Act, CRA, and national procurement guidance is increasingly favoring software with transparent, auditable, and vendor independent governance. And I mean, we've seen some countries go away from the leading cloud vendors and hyperscalers. Maybe that's not Europe's position as a whole yet, but we see more and more of this hard filters for commercial vendors to pass cleanly. So then when you have foundation hosted projects, and we are not the only one, but they look at them in a different light, and they look at them after some knowledge sharing and education as something that is not just from a procurement view probably better, but also from a transparency and from a security view. You could say, oh, this is open source, so there's a higher security risk, but the opposite is true. More people than ever can clone the repository, look at it, have to run their own additional tests on it, and it's basically much more eyes see it. So you could say there's a concentration risk argument. You could say that the recent actions from the US to then decide to impose upon Anthropic to switch off Model X's shows that somewhere out there is a switch that will turn Europe's X's off. And I think before that happens, we do want to make sure that the concentration risk is somewhat mitigated, and we don't want to be depending on one provider's API or pricing or a geopolitical situation and so on. That would tremendously add to any organization's kind of operational risk in the purchasing process and so on.
So how do the EU AI Act and the Cyber Resilience Act change the way companies should think about AI procurement and technology risk?
I mean, maybe we start with the timeline first, because it's closer than most boards realize. The general purpose AI obligations, they started in August last year, but the full enforcement for most providers lands in August this year. So we are literally a month and a bit more away. And you've got different articles. I will not go over them all here because that would probably bore some of your listeners, but we can say at a high level that these articles cover accuracy, robustness, but also cyber requirements. And then you need to publish the technical documentation, you need to have a risk assessment, and so on. And then for the CRA alone, you could say it adds another layer. Products with digital elements must meet security requirements. So that means open source is not exempt from this, but the liability rules are different for non-commercial developers. So that means in practice that enterprises need to know what is in their AI stack and be able to document it. And then foundation-hosted projects like ours, they come with an IP audit trail and governance records already in place and so on.
Microsoft, Bosch, SAP, and Huawei are all strategic members of the Eclipse Foundation. With such different commercial interests around the same table, how do you arrive at technical decisions?
I mean, for us, it was really important to have a very diverse group of strategic members. So again, that not one can dominate. So you actually want a large group and a diverse group to start with. But you also have to realize that not all strategic members work in all the different working groups we have, because that's kind of the next structural element. So the working groups could be structured around industries if you want. You have SDB, for example, for automotive. Then you have ThreadX. You have something for the CRA in terms of ORC. So you see that the working groups are around themes. And then some of the strategic members will say, this particular working group is relevant for us. We really want to contribute there. Or we will not join this particular one, but we join another one. So they will definitely sit on the same table for a few things, but not all the time. So you don't really get into a full working modus on a particular topic with 20 different strategic members. You will get a subset realistically, and sometimes that subset could be like 5 to 7 or something around there, right? And then I think I tried to explain that earlier. the technical decisions at the project level in terms of what is being built is made by the committers. So people who have earned the right to commit code by contributing. And that means over time, their contributions have been reviewed and being found excellent and so on. So over time, they get upgraded to committers. And for the committers, the commercial affiliation in terms of, oh, this one is a member of SAP or Microsoft is irrelevant in that process. So, this process has been successfully tried and tested for more than 20 years. It resolved many disagreements between much larger interests than these. And then, you have situations where commercial rivals can also be on the very same thing just because they're building something for a greater good or they're working on the industry standards that will probably benefit much more than these two or three. But they want to be putting their input and be contributing to something. And I mean, in history, you would find a lot of interesting records from these industry standards that probably would have never been created if it had been one dominating company owning that.
You use the phrase cross-pollination at the infrastructure layer. What does that look like in practice?
So I guess that's a bit like what you describe when you talk about deals, Chris, but I'm just applying it to software. So when you say the Eclipse software-defined vehicle working group, most of the German and Japanese automakers are in it. So the commercial competitors in the showroom. And yet, inside the working group, they're building the operating system stack for connected cars together. They identify protocols, they do sensor abstraction, diagnostic standards, and so on. So nobody really benefits from free and compatible operating system for connected cars. Nobody really benefits from, free and compatible identity protocols and so on. And the same logic is really applied to AI when it comes to agent runtime, model evaluation, governance, tooling, and so on. So really categories where one company building alone is kind of worse for everyone. Yeah, you can live in one silo ecosystem forever, but you then never find out what else is possible, really.
Can you give us a concrete example on how companies from different industries, for example, car companies, banks, telcos, or AI startups, collaborate around shared open source infrastructure?
Sure. I mean, for me, I think the Eclipse OpenVSX is the cleanest one really for this audience. So this is a open source extension registry behind VS Code styled editors. The feedback in the market has been tremendous. I kind of need to update all my numbers on that on a monthly basis. We are now at 600 million downloads per month. So most people that use AI coding tools, they have no idea that they're hitting our infrastructure. So you could say, regardless of whether you are in a car company, a bank, telco, or any kind of industry, if you're doing anything around AI with vibe coding and automation, you're probably using OpenVSX in the background. So when we look into the software-defined vehicle working group, it's a deeper example. We talked about the tier one suppliers, infrastructure companies, and so on. And they're building the connected car software stack together. And when it comes to the applied AI, shared infrastructure, that none of them would have maybe built alone, but that all of them benefit from. And I mentioned the historical records, and you probably find a lot more examples than I can make here, but whether it's the DVD, Bluetooth, USB, they were built by competitors. And in the end, maybe nobody owns them, but everybody uses them. I think even Fraunhofer in the early days of MP3, it was a release as open source for the public, and maybe that changed sometime later with some other players arriving. But you can tell that these standards are there because they got critical mass of competing people behind them early on, and maybe somewhat the final results were influenced by the people who wanted to play. But I think it's better outcome for consumers to have those standards than rather buying a different charger every time you buy a new phone, or a different car connecting system and so on. So I think some standards are really necessary. And when you think about European policy, when it comes to charging phones and other things, it's also about reducing waste, reducing devices, and so on. So it does have a beneficial effect, not just for the consumers, but often for the environment as well, when it comes to producing less unnecessary tech waste and so on.
What is Eclipse Open VSX, and why might many of our listeners already be using it without knowing?
So, I mean, a lot of the listeners might have at some point when they work with development teams either used something along Microsoft VS Code, or then maybe started playing with, the likes of Cursor, or in fact, any kind of Replit, any kind of AI enhanced coding tools. And most of these AI coding assistants really run the connection to OpenVSX, where they update all the different libraries close to real time. So when a developer wants to have a new plugin, and there's, I think, more than 13,000 now available on OpenVSX, it basically updated in the background. So that ensures that as you try to automate as much by giving the AI command what to build, this is all happening in the background, but it ensures that you're working with the latest set of tools and that you don't have any compatibility issues, that there are no safety issues, and so on. So the OpenVSX, you could say, it's infrastructure, key infrastructure for AI vibe coding and AI assisted coding that doesn't just make things easier and faster and more efficient, but can also have an important role to play when it comes to security and quickly rolling out updates in a time when, Mythos and other models can be let loose to find vulnerabilities and make your life miserable if you don't then patch those exploits and so on. So, for any portfolio company where you have developer tooling for AI, the users are probably hitting OpenVSX already. The question is more whether they know it.
You recently brought a Chinese AI evaluation platform into the European ecosystem. Tell us that story.
Sure. This has been an interesting one and has been with me since I joined the foundation. We had a number of discussions with the people from FLAG Eval out of the Beijing Academy of Artificial Intelligence before. But there's been a desire, based on the discussions with my colleagues before I joined, to start looking into bringing this to Europe. As I said earlier, I mean, I've been watching the Chinese models coming to the market over the last few years, and I admired not only in terms of how far they are ahead in terms of open weights and that, but I also admired some of the, you could say, creativity and the innovation approach that you saw. You're probably familiar with the DeepSeek moment from last year, where basically a model was trained on a fraction of the compute and a fraction of the chips, and where somebody has really thought about how do I put out a model with a huge number of parameters, but then only activate a fraction of that. That means that even though the model is still large, you still have a potential chance to run that at home or on a smaller hardware stack. So coming back to this, I mean, they built out a lot of different evaluation tasks across a number of modalities, from the language, multimodal, vision, and so on. And a lot of them are already evaluated. It's not so much known in the Western world, just because some of the original homepages is in Chinese. But you could say this is probably an interesting tool as we are looking for additional insights and transparency trying to evaluate models in terms of the EU AI Act. Personally, I feel this is a very interesting second opinion on the models in the market. And with the further build out, they will probably also go towards addressing a number of the requirements of the EU AI Act in terms of benchmarking and transparency and robustness. So it's like, comparing this to the financial world, you don't want to just have one rating from one rating agency. Ideally, if you're trying to raise capital, you are rated by a number of leading ones, and there's a second opinion, not just one. And that gives you a stronger negotiation position in terms of explaining your things to the public in that case, or in your financial case, in terms of raising additional finance at a slightly lower interest rate and so on. So it's really like a second vantage point. It's can be done remotely and without the model leaving your environment. So the IP protection is somewhat built in. It's an interesting one. It's been proposed. It's been publicized on the website, but it's not fully available in terms of the full service just yet.
Why is that a good example of a non-sourcing?
I guess when we start with the knowns here, Hugging Face, the dominant US-based evaluation platform, everybody knew it was there. Yes, they might have been originated in France, but I think it's often when we talk about AI in Europe, the first kind of viewpoint goes towards the US and what we are familiar with, maybe sometimes due to a lot of advertising and a lot of exposure. But when you think of it from the European perspective, where we know that we are behind, we know that we have to push quite a number of buttons to have a chance to be in that space and to continue to compete. I don't think we can afford just to look westwards and hope that they don't press the switch that then disables our access from frontier models. I think we need to do better than this. And the unknown here pretty much is the 5 years of evaluation work sitting at the Beijing Academy of Artificial Intelligence, producing a framework that is technically ahead of some of these Western frameworks. And maybe for those who haven't seen that yet, shortly after GPT was released, the Beijing Academy of AI did release a model called Wudao. It was not really publicized in the Western world, but it had 10 times the amount of parameters than GPT had. It was not commercialized because they didn't put the effort in marketing. They're a research organization, right? So they're a very strong research organization, but their point is not on the pure commercial. So they popped up on my AI radar a couple of years back. I didn't see something from them much in the meantime, but now if we want to also start looking eastwards, and this is kind of really the missing piece. So the opportunity was outside the obvious field of vision, and bringing Pan-Eval in the cross-pollination field, you could say, applied it to the AI infrastructure sourcing.
So if I am advising a founder building something in AI infrastructure, why should they bring part of their work into the Eclipse Foundation rather than keeping everything closed?
Well, I think I mentioned it earlier. I had a lot of fun working for startups. I've also been mentor of startups for the last 13 years, probably advised more than 30 of them. I currently sit on the board of a UK-based startup. So you could say I spend a lot of my free time with startups. And while this is exciting and my personal passion, it also shows that it's a hard world out there, and the funding cycle and everything abroad. I think you should use a boost. And now let me explain what I mean here. The objection that I hear most from European AI founders is, why would I open source any of my IP? I'm trying to build a company. But open source is not about give away everything. It's more like a wedge. You may open source the protocol, the runtime, the foundational layer. You keep the value-added enterprise features as a paid product. So you could kind of compare it to, the innovation wave we saw on the mobile or tablet devices, where you have a freemium model, right? You get exposure by open sourcing something or giving something for free. You get marketing, you get other things. So let's say for Red Hat, Elastic, Hugging Face, they all started building on this pattern. The exits are real. The venture investor increasingly understand it. Like if you go to the VC, and that will be an interesting question for you, given your exposure in that world, and you would say, "Oh, I want to open source everything," and probably more, you would be close to being shown the door. But if you say, "I strategically want to open this very piece because I know I'm going to get more feedback, more exposure, maybe even some collaborators, maybe even some people joining my firm, recruitment, whatever you want to call it. And I get people excited about what I do rather than being drowned out in the ocean that has become the AI startup world, right? 13 years ago, when I was at the beginning of my journey, even for London, there were not like dozens of companies around doing AI. There was no AI hype. There was no everything ML washed or AI washed or Gen AI washed. It was a different world. Right now, I think the funding is difficult. I'm happy to take your comments on this, but it's like without AI, Gen AI things, it's probably very difficult. So the funding is difficult, but you have to understand that just by giving a module or component for free will probably rather give you additional visibility and commercial things that you can build upon. So a foundation hosted project is kind of a deal sourcing wedge into European AI procurement. The startup that provides the vendor independent options becomes attractive both as an alliance partner and investment target. And you could have, using ours or others, streamlined process for new projects proposals. So the default answer is kind of, let's try to find the right shape for this and maybe not just say no to this.
So where does the line sit between what a startup should open source and what it should keep proprietary as a paid product?
I mean, some full research data on this would be fascinating. Maybe we leave that for another conversation. But the protocol layer, the runtime, evaluation framework, those are kind of strong candidates for open sourcing because nobody differentiates on that kind of plumbing, right? And then the enterprise features that reduce operational friction for paying customers, configuration management, access protocols, audit logging, SLA guarantees, those have to stay paid because that is a service you provide. And that is a service where you only can decide in terms of how you structure that in a way that it makes sense for you to scale, right? And then the discipline question really is, which layer is your actual mode? So just by, tagging your startup with crypto or Gen AI, whatever it is, alone will probably not sell it. But open sourcing your mode would be a strategic mistake. But open sourcing the layer beneath is a growth engine that gets you attraction. The foundation's IP management can really help you. It gives you a clean legal record of what you contributed and what you retained. And that matters in any due diligence. And I think you can have interesting conversations in terms of how many additional downloads or how many additional collaborator you got for what you shared afterwards, right? I mean, there are companies behind OpenVSX. It's an interesting question whether they would have managed to reach the 600 million downloads a month or that trajectory. Of course, that is not something that we have for most projects, but I think you see a decent uptick in usage and so on once it's in the public space with some well-known committers and so on.
Yeah, but from an investor's perspective, is open source a moat or a leak?
Personally, and I had my chance to work with a number of investors in my London days with Illuminate, with Octopus, and with Balderton, and a few more. It's a mode if you understand the mechanism. I think it's more like a leak if you do not. The mode is not, nobody can copy my code. That was never the mode really in software ever. The mode is really distribution, community trust, and being really the neutral layer everybody builds on the top of. You could say people will probably not have a demand for your solution if they haven't heard of you, or if you get drowned out by the other, I don't know, 10,000 AI startups that are claiming to do your use case. But if you had some industry people and trusted committers review what you can deliver on open source, and then getting interested in what you build on top of this, that's maybe a different proposition. So we could make many industry examples from Red Hat, IBM, Elastic, and HashiCorp. But I think the axes really follow a consistent pattern, but I haven't done my fully data analysis on this. So the leak happens when you open source the wrong layer, the layer where you actually differentiate. This is more like a strategy era, I would say, not an open source era. And investors can still frame open source as commercially risky, but that is, personally, it's kind of using a 2005 mental model. The market has moved on, and particularly in my area of AI hype cycles, you kind of need to look for any kind of differentiating factor. And having been audited, been seen through, cloned, reviewed, and so on, for me, that shows there is real substance to what you're building, rather than just claiming something in slides and then not allowing anyone to see any of the code, right? So it's a different approach, but I personally believe in it. And based on some of the conversation with the investors, I think they are also becoming more and more technical in terms of what they want to see from a startup in that space.
So, what evidence should investors look at when assessing whether an open source AI company has a defensible commercial model?
So, I mean, for me, that's kind of active contributor community, not just the download. So you want really to have contributors that are doing a lot on this. And for me, that is the leading indicators. Downloads are a vanity metric. So yeah, the 600 million a month is great. But I think the difference, the mode or the gap in the market or the differentiating factors, you wouldn't be able to sustain if you don't have a healthy number of contributors who are very active on this. So commercial users who can really contribute back, that is really like a virtuous cycle, right? If paying customers also contributing code, you have a mode. This is like a platform. You could compare it to, social media where people share their data on LinkedIn or Facebook and anything. And some of them are paying customers, but you build a platform with that data, and in that case, with the software that is being committed. And in terms of the clear commercial wedge, the paid product still exists. It is distinct from the open layer, and it's growing because of the interest you generate at the different layer. So then you could say another one could be named enterprise adopters in regulated sectors. I mean, in my past life, I was very much close to some of the financial regulators and central banks. And you could say the same about maybe the automotive space or healthcare, where company do some serious due diligence. And if they adopted your stack, your IP is probably clean. And then foundation hosting is also a signal in terms of IP governance, development process, contributor agreement, all has been audited. And in that way reduces M&A legal risk significantly.
So, you are engaged in policy conversations with the G7 under the French presidency. and with the United Nations AI advisory body. What is the conversation in 1 minute?
I guess I'm not at liberty to talk about all of the details, and it's also fair to say that I don't get engaged on those kind of things and every week. But there's a number of things where my voice and my colleagues were listened to, and I personally really enjoy this. So, in terms of open source is stopped really being a pure developer topic, I would say maybe in the last 18 months. And then when it comes to the whole discussions we had over the last few years now in terms of sovereignty, maybe some of this was kicked off by tariffs, but also other things. There's a big EU sovereignty train. You probably saw the digital packages that have been finalized a couple of weeks back. And personally, I see the same interest by the UN, where I was surprised. Maybe they've been running this in the years before, but there's actually next week, there's a UN open source week in New York. For the whole week, you have a lot of public discussions with their global head of AI and so on. So even the UN takes a interest in open source as a transparent way to collaborate, a transparent way to have some sovereignty and some fairness. So I think over the last 20 years, we somewhat earned to be asked to join those discussions because we are nonprofit, we are vendor neutral, we are European. And I think we proved that we could be a steward for production grade software. So that means we are operators, we are actually doing the tech, but we're not just a think tank. It's great if people come to us with technical questions in terms of policy drafts and so on. And I'm personally very happy to contribute and do knowledge sharing and all of this. But who really shows up at the open source table shapes what gets built. And this is true at the technical level, but it is also true policy level. And I'm very glad that European politicians understand open source more than a few years ago. They understand it doesn't increase the risk, but rather gives them more sovereignty, and they understand it's a key building block as Europe moves towards a more independent and sovereign model.
Why should this matter to a VCA member advising an enterprise client on AI procurement and governance or M&A?
I think your members advising enterprise on M&A or fundraising in regulated sectors are probably increasingly briefing clients on AI procurement decisions where vendor independence is becoming a filter. And I think your members who invest in AI startups, and I've invested in quite a few, are looking at companies whose commercial mode depends on how the open source layer underneath them evolves. And some of the members who run companies considering like a AI transformation, if you want, they need to know which institutional structures will really shape what European AI looks like in a couple of years' time, right? I mean, we know the AI Act is going live fully in August, as we said. Do we know yet about the regulatory fines, how much teeth the regulator will show? There's some open questions there, but you kind of want to get a steer to be able to say, is that a safe investment? Is that somebody who's already not looking into this? Is somebody who's done their homework? And yeah, I mean, the timeline is real. The full enforcement lands, and boards who have not started their AI governance due diligence are a bit behind by now.
So where is the European AI policy most likely to help open source AI?
So I think there are three areas where policy can generally help. The first would be treating open source as infrastructure and the AI Act framework. So kind of like the safety obligations, not the same liability regime and so on. And then kind of the second piece would be procurement, so guidance, what explicitly recognizes like a vendor neutral foundation governed software as a preferred category for public sector AI. And then the last one, the public funding. I think we will see more and more of this, and you've seen it in some of the European data factories. And I have to admit, some other countries are a bit ahead of us here in Germany. But for open source AI infrastructure, the way that public money funds roads and power grids, so the EU's Horizon program is kind of the precedent, and there's more to come. And then when you look at the French presidency in terms of the G7, they're really pushing for these interoperability standards. So this is kind of like the fourth lever, preventing that there is a proprietary lock-in in the infrastructure layer. So there's really a strong drive for European independence on that front.
Yes, and on the other side, I mean, where could policy accidentally damage the open source AI ecosystem?
I think that can also happen based on maybe sometimes misunderstanding, but the biggest risk is applying kind of commercial vendor liability frameworks to open source maintainers, right? If you have somebody who's willingly contributing their time and effort and sometimes working for a company, sometimes on their own, if you put a burden in terms of governance, a too high burden in terms of documentation and so on, then you're kind of, I think, maybe missing one of the things. Instead of getting more people to look at an issue and providing solutions, you then have a barrier to entry that makes it harder. So a solely contributor who published a project 5 years ago, they cannot absorb the compliance burden that is, proportionate for Microsoft. Or when you're talking about the Cyber Resilience Act, that had this very problem in its first draft. The open source community, they had to really push back hard and want some of their protections. The risk of regulatory drift remains. So it's always kind of like educating and re-educating. And then the second risk is heavy general purpose AI compliance burden on open foundation models that lack the resources of front-end model providers. So the proportionality does matter. If you do want people to share the data and not just the weights and share the methods and so on, then you need to make it easy for them and not create additional burdens that the other ones don't respect anyways, right? And then maybe the last one is speed. If the regulatory requirements change faster than foundation hosted projects can adapt, then probably smaller projects drop out. The survivors are the ones with large commercial backing, which kind of defeats the vendor neutrality point. So I'm not saying there's like a quick fix solution that I can give here on the podcast, but I think it's just a awareness of where do you want to kind of lay the cutoff or the edge cases. How difficult do you want to make it for people to contribute in terms of their innovation and so on, without creating too many hurdles, right? If we want to have innovation in Europe, then let's not overburden people too much. Let's be clear, but then we also need to let people go.
He says ECA member wants to engage with this topic tomorrow. Where should he start?
Free entry points, depending on what you do. So startups you advise or invest in, if they're building anything in AI infrastructure, like say model evaluation or government tooling, you can connect them to us if you like. So easy to find me on LinkedIn. I've been AI thought leader there for probably more than 10 years, but you can also write me an email at michael.berns@eclipse-foundation.org. If it's M&A and business development professionals, when you scan portfolios or build target lists in AI, you could add foundation hosted projects as a category. So that means they become increasingly relevant as alliance partners and investment adjacent targets. And then lastly, member companies in regulated industries. If your engineering leadership is working through like a build, buy or open source question, then you could become a member and it's a credible move. I think the cost would be pretty trivial next to the concentration risk of relying on any single supplier. So you could say it's all about self-empowerment, right? In my old line of work, I built AI solutions. I created PowerPoints, and then I eventually left the client to their own devices. Hopefully, many learned how to build up a team, and sometimes I help them to be self-government. But in some cases, they're still not able to swim themselves. And ideally, when you think about true north and making a difference, you want to get people there so that they have some of their own capabilities and they get to a place where they can see what good looks like.
So, what would you say to a funder who is still on the fence about open source AI as a strategic frame?
I think that fence is hopefully getting smaller every year. We talked about the companies who've been sold in the public domain for many billions in terms of having been open source and so on. So the pattern is really established for some VCs that now have a framework for it. So I think there is a case of find somebody who gives you the multipliers and has the understanding for that, who values your kind of company based on that. And I think if you find the right ones, and they should be getting more and more, then the specific risk is not really open source versus closed. It's more like a strategy question. And the question is not whether to open source. The question is which layer to open source and which layer to keep as your commercial wedge. And I've been filling out these running lean and lean startup sheets for so many of the startups I mentored over the last 13 years. And when you kind of able to consolidate what you do on one single page, I think you should also be able to consolidate and have a strategic thing. What is my real mode and where could I do with like a booster rocket on the side? So if you get that decision right, I think open source has all the potential to be a great growth engine for you.
What would you say to an investor who sees open source as commercially risky?
I think I would ask them to date stamp their view. So, like I said, in 2005, the risk framing was reasonable. The commercial models were maybe immature. The exits in that space were thin. But fast forward 21 years, the exits are real. The models are documented, and quite a few institutional investors have frameworks for open source, dual license, and enterprise add-on structures. And I mean, when you look at the KPIs in terms of ARR and investor traction in the market, exposure, then the marketing spend or being found, featured, getting in front of customers, it has some of their own metrics, right? So I think from that, you could say that foundation hosting reduces a lot of the specific risks, the IP disputes, contributor agreement gaps, government opacity, and I would say maybe in the recent times, also security risks. We've scanned pretty much all of our repositories with the latest frontier models. And it's, I think, particularly on the security front, in a very fast, dynamic world where vulnerabilities are exploited every day, I think to have some additional eyes on the security side cannot harm you. It will give you probably more homework, but it will be good for you, even if you don't know it when you receive that feedback.
So, what would you say to an enterprise leader who wants AI innovation, but also wants control, governance, and procurement discipline?
I think these are not so much in maybe competition or tension as the framing suggests. The foundation hosted open source gives you kind of both access to innovation from a global contributor community. Yes, you can say we have our heart in Europe, and maybe a lot of our community is also in Europe, but equally we have contributors from really around the world. So you have a governance that gives you full audit trails, IP clarity, and you can defend your procurement process. I think the alternative closed commercial AI gives you somewhat innovation without control. You're dependent on the vendor's roadmap, pricing, and continued existence. And for certain cases, that can also be great. But the choice, again, is not open source or controlled. It's kind of which kind of control do you really want? Do you want like the document development process, contributor agreements on file? No single company can change direction without the committed community agreeing. And maybe you want the AI Act compliance picture, foundational hosted projects come with governance documentation already in place. This is a procurement shortcut your legal teams will probably appreciate.
Is there anything important you'd like all members to take away that I have not asked you about?
Well, I think we talked about the EU AI Act endlessly, so keep the August deadline in mind. But most boards are still treating AI governance as a future agenda item. Believe me, it's not. It's a current operational risk. And I think we can help by, in some ways, offering a shortcut in terms of the foundation-hosted AI projects that come with some of these homework that maybe some of the boards should have done. And then for enterprise and regulated sectors, maybe one that hasn't mapped its AI stack against the AI Act requirements. Map it now, do it now. I think that's a key thing. And then the broader point, European AI infrastructure really needs the European institutions to build it. And that means the more members, contributors, and projects we and others in Europe have, the stronger that layers becomes for everyone, and the stronger case I think we can make for Europe's sovereignty and independence.
Thank you, Michael. I think today's conversation has helped us look below the surface of AI adoption. It is not only about which model, which tool, or which use case a company should adopt. It is also about the infrastructure behind AI, the governance model behind that infrastructure, and the strategic choices companies and investors make when deciding who controls the technology they rely on. For the VCA ecosystem, this is a particularly important message. Many opportunities do not sit in the obvious box. They sit in the unknown unknowns, at the intersection of policy, technology, procurement, open source communities, enterprise governance, and commercial strategy. Open source AI is not simply about giving technology away. As Michael explained, it can become a commercial wedge, a trust mechanism, a procurement advantage, and a way for startups, enterprises, and investors to collaborate around shared infrastructure while still building differentiated business models. To our audience, if you're working on an AI adoption, AI procurement, AI infrastructure, governance, M&A, or investment strategy, this is a topic worth taking seriously. Michael, thank you again for sharing your perspective with us. And to our audience, thank you for watching the VCA podcast. Please hit the subscribe button and see you in the next episode.